About 60 meters from our company's position, the course of the Volga River had created a slough at a bend in the river channel. The Germans occupied one side of this little slough, and we, the other. Here our lines were within spitting distance of each other. It probably would have been more expedient if one side or the other had yielded and withdrawn from this narrow projection of water. But neither our command nor the enemy's showed any desire to blink first. However, by some unspoken agreement among the men, the opposing sides here didn't bother each other. When they informed me of my assignment as the new commander of this nasty sector of the front line, I didn't celebrate. It meant I would have to leave my company, to which I had become accustomed, and the friendships I had formed with the men in it. But an order is an order. On the 30th of December, we warmly said our farewells, and I shook hands with each man. I had learned about my new assignment that morning. That afternoon, I received the most valuable gift a man can get at the front, and a New Year's gift at that. It was a letter from Mamma. She had sent it from Kishtim on the 10th of December, probably with the hope that I would receive it by New Year's. Her wish was fulfilled, and now I was reading the letter over and over again. My dear son, what a fine fellow you are for not forgetting about us. Each one of your letters is a holiday for us. In the morning, I catch sight of Shura, our mail carrier, through the window. A good, kind woman. She walks up with her large mail pouch, which hides so much inside it, both joy and just as much grief. She pulls a familiar triangular-shaped letter out of her pouch, and we sit at the table. I fill a bowl of soup for her. I put on my glasses and read your letter in a loud voice. Shura is somewhat deaf. She listens, eats her soup, and cries. Her husband is at the front. She has received nothing from him since 1941. In the evening, I read your letter to your father over the telephone. He spends weeks at his office without coming home. The industrial complex is growing. Soon its output, and you know what it is, will be going to its destination. Forgive me for passing along some sad news. You get enough of that there. My sister Fanechka has passed away. We cut off a few locks of her lovely curls as a keepsake. We buried Fanechka in Kishtim. I congratulate you on the approaching new year. May it be happy and victorious for us all. Take care of yourself, my dear son, but understand me correctly. I am not asking you to duck the demands of the army. But remember, you have a weak throat. Don't smoke in the cold. Try not to drink any cold water. In your childhood, you were often sick with angina. Take more steam baths. God forbid that anything leads you down the wrong path. I remember the year 1921. I was serving then in the Red Army's 12th Army. It was advancing on Warsaw, but suddenly in Novograd-Volinsk I fell ill with typhus, and they left me in a local hospital to die. There were good people there. They nursed me back to health and found some work for me. At the time, we all lived according to the proletarian principle. Whoever doesn't work, doesn't eat. In that quaint and green little city, I met your future papa. I was only 17 then. I had still not completely gotten over my illness, but ever since my childhood I had loved the theatre and took part in local productions. At the City Club, we put on some revolutionary play. I don't remember its name. Your future papa came to the show and, like everybody else, loudly applauded our performance. We became acquainted that evening. We began to meet and fell in love with each other. What your father found so special in me, I don't know. I was still weak, frail, and my hair hadn't grown back in yet. He's a romantic, just like you. We got married. Time passed, and you appeared. Novograd-Volinsk. There we first met, and there you were born. Isn't that fate? Fate is a blue bird, which brought all three of us happiness. I believe that this bird will protect you now. Yesterday evening I bumped into the director of the plant, where you started work as a lathe operator. He asked to pass along his regards to you. With every passing day they are increasing their production. Natasha often spends time with us. She has a new son. She calls him Andrei, in honor of his father. She painted your portrait from your last photograph as a civilian. I've hung it in the dining hall and never get tired of looking at you. Natasha told me how her pilot husband was killed in the first days of the war. He had just fastened himself into the cockpit of an airplane and was about to take off, but never managed to do it. The German airplanes pounced. They found him dead in his destroyed airplane. I kiss you, my dear son, your mother. Close to evening on the 30th of December, I took over my new company. It had 36 men and 2 officers. I first got acquainted with the officers. One of them, Lieutenant Gorbanov, had temporarily been the acting commander of the company. The second, Junior Lieutenant Velenki, commanded a platoon. I already knew that Gorbanov had survived a stretch in the penal battalion, had been wounded and then restored to his former rank. That meant he had fully atoned for his guilt, but what his transgression was, I didn't know. He made a good impression on me. He was a strong guy of short stature. Velenki was out of a completely different mould. He was very young, not even 19. He had recently graduated from the Omsk Combat Infantry Specialist School, and from there went directly to the front. It was clear that he had not yet been under fire. He was somewhat frail, and it seemed to me he did not have a very stable personality. He still didn't feel fully in command, and he didn't understand people well. He couldn't tell me very much about his men. Understanding his own weaknesses, he was a nervous man prone to breakdowns. After our conversation, we took a tour of all the positions in the trenches. I cursorily made the acquaintance of the soldiers and managed to have a brief chat with only 2 or 3 of them. "Have you ever been in an attack?" I asked one. "All kinds of attacks," he answered. "It's good when the German buggers off when we attack, then it's everyone forward. If he doesn't, we leap into his trenches and have at him with the bayonet, the snake. Then Fritz comes to his senses and tries to chuck us out. If we don't have artillery support, we retreat, but as long as we have one heavy gun helping us, we kick the shit out of him. You've been in an attack and survived. Good man." It didn't turn out that way for everyone. Apparently a trustworthy soldier, I thought. You can't go wrong with someone like him. This conversation calmed me down, but all the same I decided that the next morning I had to study the personnel files, change the company's routines, and urgently put my system in place. For the meantime, I asked Gorbunov and Velenki to visit all the posts at night. I returned to my command dugout. Extreme fatigue drew me to my bunk. Tomorrow was the last day of 1942. I'd spent a full year in the army. How naive and stupid we had been to believe that the war would soon end. Now I knew that with patriotism and a rifle alone, you couldn't take the enemy. I thought back to my arrival at the specialist school a year ago. The empty barracks, Rizai, his songs with the guitar. How many of us were still alive? Yet nevertheless, tomorrow without fail, I'd greet the new year with the soldiers, and we'd organize a fitting salute. Just then, the junior lieutenant burst into my dugout like a whirlwind. His face was pale, his coat was unfastened, and he wasn't wearing his fur cap. I immediately understood that something serious had happened. "Comrade Company Commander!" he almost shouted. "It's a disaster, a terrible disaster, a desertion. 2 of them, one of the old guys and a new conscript." I sprang to my feet. Sleep disappeared in a flash. We rushed into the trench. 2 fully operational and well-maintained rifles and a Komsomol card were lying neatly on the breastworks, lightly powdered with snow. It seems I had met these, I couldn't bring myself to say the words, now former soldiers. They had greeted me affably when I had come by their post. Where were they from? How and where had they fought? What were their names? I knew nothing about them. The old soldier must have persuaded the new conscript, the Komsomol member. The latter, I suddenly remembered, had been whining about something, probably as a diversion. It seems he was saying he hadn't been paid in 3 months. Yes, my inner voice had misled me. I looked at the abandoned rifles and suddenly felt queasy. A group flight, that meant the penal battalion. It had to be that way. We quickly got organized. Lieutenant Gorbanov hurried out with a group of men. I left the dugout last, moving along with Velenki and 2 soldiers. But I realized that even the fastest pursuit could not reach the deserters in time. On the way back to my dugout, I met a familiar, almost dear face in the dark. He was a soldier from my company. He was hiding behind a bent tree. I greeted him warmly, but he took off at once. I stopped and stared after him. "Drink up, Comsorg! You did your duty honourably, and I can see you're frozen." I tasted cognac for the first time. I could feel the warmth of the noble drink spreading through my body. I forgot about my angry tirades and suddenly felt very sleepy. I hadn't slept the previous 2 nights. But Ivan Yakovlevich detained me. Apparently, trying to justify his behaviour, he began to talk. "My family has perished. I met Lydia Nikolaevna a long time ago, and we fell in love. If we're lucky enough to survive to the end of this war, we're going to get married." Fate turned out otherwise. In 1943, Gruzdev was sent to the Military Political Academy in Moscow. He graduated as a lieutenant colonel, acquired a new family, his frontline love was forgotten, and moved to Ivanovo to serve. In the 1970s, we met each other again in Moscow when he and his wife came for the Victory Day celebrations. But back in the dugout, as I prepared to leave, Gruzdev suddenly asked, "Do you at least know what Lenin said at the Third Komsomol Congress? What the Komsomol's main tasks are as the party's top assistant? What honours the Komsomol has earned? What the 5 primary features of the patriotic war are, as formulated by Comrade Stalin? Are these things really important for a Komsomol member to know as he heads into battle?" I asked. "It is important, first of all, for you to know. You are now a leader of young men and women. Have I made myself clear?" My new home was a small, cosy dugout in the political unit. Everyone greeted me in a friendly fashion. We exchanged greetings as we were supposed to do. There were 3 of us in the dugout: the regiment's party organizer, the regiment's political agitator, and me. "Make yourself comfortable. Here's your refuge now," they said, gesturing at an empty bunk. I guessed that just 2 weeks ago this had been Tolia Razumov's place. As I approached the bunk to drop my stuff onto it, I noticed a small trunk beneath it. I figured it must have been Tolia's, but I didn't ask about it. Usually, for the position of a regiment's Komsorg, a young communist was selected from among the officer political workers. But here they had chosen a combat commander who was not even a party member yet. Power corrupts. I witnessed how some officers, upon receiving a promotion to a higher rank, sharply changed their behaviour, showing arrogance, insolence, even cynicism. Their kindness disappeared, and for the sake of their careers they forgot about their comrades, with whom, just the day before, they had been eating from the same pot of food or drinking their 100 grams of vodka from the same mug. So I tried to watch myself so as not to break my own inner code of decency. I rubbed shoulders with the men in the ranks and tried to sense their moods, since as a platoon leader and company commander, I had become convinced that the combat spirit of people depended largely on their mood and emotional state. To support a person, to listen to their every word attentively, these I saw as my primary tasks as Komsorg. Before one battle, I was talking with a young soldier, and I asked him, "When will you turn in your application for the Komsomol?" In response, I heard, "You want to make a Komsomol member of me, Komsorg? You dream of giving me a membership card? I have all of 3 hours left to live before we attack. So, Comrade Lieutenant, you'd better find someone else." The soldier's reply rattled me, and I couldn't regain my composure for a long time. Our regiment commander liked to say, "I would like to kiss every soldier and officer in my command, because they are fighting for our families back home." But why should anyone want to kiss him back? Every day he was sending hundreds, even thousands of men to their doom. I had serious divergences with him here. One day, an Osobist called the political unit and asked to meet with me. You couldn't expect anything good from these people. We had a conversation. "Do you know, Lieutenant, the Komsomol member Abram Rosenfeld?" "I've heard of him." "It seems he deliberately shot himself in the foot. They exposed his crime at the Medsenbat, and he has confessed. There is a report from the company commander. We intended to turn the matter over to a tribunal, but for political reasons we came to a different decision. Commissar Borisov recommended that we speak with you. We want you to have a chat with Rosenfeld. Try and find out whether this scum intends to fight honourably, and then let us know." I decided to get Gruzdev's advice on this matter. He, as always, passed the buck. Borisov has made a recommendation, so now go do it. I summoned Abram to the political unit. We were alone. First of all, I asked him, "Is it true what your company commander, the doctors, and the Osobists are saying and writing?" He confirmed everything. He swore never to do such a thing again, and explained, "My nerves simply gave out." I asked him to tell me about himself, where he was from, and how he wound up at the front. Back in his childhood, he had discovered that he had the gift of art. In 1940, he enrolled in the Architectural Institute in Moscow. During the hard days around Moscow in the autumn of 1941, the Institute's Komsorg had proposed that the entire group of students, who had not yet been called into the army, should volunteer for the front. Within a few weeks, they were given uniforms and weapons and sent to the distant approaches to Moscow. Almost everyone was killed in the ensuing battle. He and 2 other students wound up in a hospital and then were sent back to the front. I understand that as a Jew, I have a special responsibility. I must fight not only for our motherland and for myself, but also for my people, who Hitler is destroying. You understand correctly, I affirmed, but you walked away from your responsibility. Do you know, Abram, what awaits those men who intentionally wound themselves? I know. Please call me a brash, like everybody calls me. If you permit, I'd like to speak openly. You've summoned me as a Komsomol member, and I trust you. Of course. I'm from Vinitsa. There were a lot of Jews in this city before the war, and all the Jewish families observed the religious traditions and spoke Yiddish. Sholem Aleichem wrote about it in his stories. It's a classic of Yiddish literature, which is highly regarded in our country and around the world. Perhaps you've heard of him? No, Abrash, unfortunately I haven't read him. Read it, you won't regret it. I studied in a Yiddish school and attended the synagogue on Saturdays. In Vinitsa and in Moscow, nobody ever criticized me for this. At the front, especially in the front lines, I can't observe the Jewish traditions. But this company commander who wrote the report nastily insulted me in front of my comrades and even promised to send me in front of a tribunal. Why? I had asked him to release me from sentry duty on a Saturday. I wanted to pray for Mama and Papa. He shouted at me, "Does this mean you don't want to fight on Saturdays? Oh, you! You yourself understand what kind of stuff," he then said to me. He beat me unmercifully. I didn't cry. I only said, "How are you, Soviet officer, any better than the fascists?" He became enraged and promised to deal with me. I became angered and indignant after hearing what Abram had told his commanding officer. I said to him, "The company commander treated you impermissibly and insulted your national feelings. But you're a fine one. To compare an officer of the Red Army with Hitler's executioners, that's blasphemy." At this point, I lost all control of myself. Instead of a discussion, I suddenly lashed out at Abrash, knocked him off his feet, and threw him out of the dugout. For the first time in my life, I had raised my hand against another man. How could I have behaved that way? Was that any way to treat a Komsomol member? It was a loathsome act. What kind of leader of youth could I be after that? For several days, I walked around completely out of sorts. Now and then, I wanted to seek out Abrash at the front, to seek his forgiveness, for the devil knows what he might be thinking about me now. I thought over what I could do, about how I might defend a Komsomol member from his company commander, who was also an anti-Semite and a dull-witted man. But I never offered a defence for him. There was only one thing left for me to do. I secured Abrash's transfer to a different battalion. One day, an aging soldier with tired, sad eyes approached me, and in a single breath he poured out an entire cascade of short phrases. There was anguish and alarm in his voice, and agonizing tears in his eyes. "I'm a Leningrader, the docent of the Gertsen Pedagogical Institute, the author of many well-known books and articles about Gorky, our stormy petrel of revolution. I'm 44. There's a lot I can do and want to do. I have a wife and 2 kids. They're right now in the blockaded city. They are dying, just like all Leningraders. They're starving to death." I gently responded, "Forgive me. What's your question?" I saw tears welling in his eyes behind his glasses, and he asked, "Please, get me out of the front lines. I'm ready for any duty, even a transport driver." What could I say? But he continued, "Oh God, if I'm killed, who can give a better lecture on Stalin's favourite story? The old woman Isagil than me? What do you think? Perhaps we should write a letter to Comrade Stalin. He'll understand me better than all of you. Do you really think that Comrade Stalin has no other concerns today while this terrible war is going on?" He gave an ironic smile and said, "Let me tell you an old parable. One day, for some reason, an old woman decided to appeal personally to the Roman emperor with a request. His guards wouldn't let her in, and they told her that His Majesty had no time to meet with her and hear her request. Then the old woman replied, 'If he has no time to meet with his own citizen, that means he can't be the emperor.'" I thanked the Leningrad docent for his wonderful parable, shook his hand and said warmly, "Never lose spirit. Don't succumb to any gloomy thoughts. We'll meet again after the war. I want to enroll in your institute, the best pedagogical institute in the land. I'll most certainly come to hear your lectures." He grew up in a family with a long line of textile workers. He completed all 4 grades of schooling. During his 5th year of education, he dropped out and became a factory apprentice. He joined the Komsomol at 14. Soon he realized that being a Komsomol activist had its advantages. After a year, the bright young Komsomol member was chosen as secretary of the factory's Komsomol organization. At this point, life brought him together with the factory's party chief. In his new role, Gavrilov tried to help the party chief in every possible way. He carted off the party dues, painted the walls of the party room as well as the walls in the chief's home, drove at the chief's request to local party patrons, and organized holidays and ceremonial evenings at the factory. Time passed, and he fell in love with a young Komsomol weaver at the factory. They married, and over the next 7 years, his wife, Katenka, gave birth to 4 fine boys. The extra mouths made life harder. The factory party chief helped him out by making Gavrilov an inspector in the district executive committee, specifically in the Department of People's Nutrition, which controlled and distributed government food rations, a position one could only dream of. On the eve of war, Gavrilov was called into the army and assigned to a political staff. He went through a 3-month course of training, where he studied the short course on the history of the VKPB, Stalin's mandatory and imaginative history of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks. He was accepted into the party because of his working-class origins. In 1941, he was sent to Relentless, where the 220th Rifle Division was forming. Considering his pre-war work experience, Gavrilov's superior officers assigned him to work in the commissary as the director of the food storehouse. He punctually supplied the regiments with food, and so was chosen to be the party organizer of the division's rear area, a highly coveted position. But he didn't last long in that role, as many others sought such a lucrative position. At Ruzhev, Mikhalich lost a little status. He was removed from his supply post and given the post of party worker. He was later appointed to be the party organizer for the 673rd Rifle Regiment. Continually rubbing shoulders with Gavrilov at Ruzhev, and later at Dubrovno, Orsha and Smolensk, I came to the conclusion that at the front, this party organizer was busy with 2 primary tasks: to stay alive at any cost, and to be a reliable commissary for his family back in Ivanovo. Mikhalich was completely indifferent to the misfortunes of others, and never sought any motivation or cause to lead a soldier into battle other than for the motherland, for Stalin. At the same time, he was kind-hearted toward communists and indulgent of their sins, as long as they didn't exceed the boundaries of military law. The party organizer himself, it must be said, was far from without sins. He never missed a day when he would toss back not only his own ration of vodka, but also that of the teetotaling agitator. If the opportunity arose, he'd drink even more. Mikhalich noticed the well-built village laundress Serafima, who was busty but had a young girl's waistline. He dropped in to see her much more often than he went to the front. One morning he woke me up right at 5 a.m. and said, "Come with me, Komsomol member." We walked a short way and emerged into a forest clearing, where he planted me on a stump and said, "See the third dugout in the left row? Once you see the chimney start to smoke, go away. But in the meantime, sit and see to it that no party or non-party swine disturbs me. Understood?" What's this, another party task? Only this time the protagonists have changed, I wondered. There was the party organizer for you. But after some time passed in our association, I began to notice one strange behaviour. As much as he could, and Mikuláš could do a lot, he tried to shelter me from German bullets. With all his effort, he kept me away from the front lines and out of battles, wherever they occurred, by tying me up with all sorts of busy work. He often dragged me along with him to party gatherings, meetings, and inspections. I began trying to evade him. Why was he acting this way? Was he trying to nurture my party ideals? Hardly, for I doubt he had ever woken up in the morning with those on his mind. I speculated endlessly about his motives. As it turned out, he was protecting me for his own sake, for the sake of his secret personal interests. But I found out about this only after the war, when, now at home, I read through his letters. Concealing it from me, he wrote letters to my mother during the war, lamenting the situation of his own 4 sons and claiming that he was my best friend and my father at the front. My frontline father so moved my mother to pity that she started sending parcels to Ivanovo, often depriving herself and my father of many things. Commissar Gruzdev valued Mikuláš, knowing that the clever man from Ivanovo was very crafty and knew how to get around anyone in any situation. Accordingly, he entrusted the party organizer of the regiment with an important sector, the rear. Gruzdev always felt calm about his decision, knowing that the battalions always received their stew, bread, something to smoke, weapons and ammunition on time. Once a crack appeared in my relations with Mikuláš. And what a crack! I thought that after the sharp conversation that occurred between us, Mikuláš would break with me. But he didn't. Here's what happened. From September 1941 on, the entire country sent entire trainloads of gifts to the front. The fathers, mothers, and wives of frontline soldiers sent us everything they could, often the very latest things: blankets, undergarments, warm knitted socks and mittens. Soldiers often used warm socks as mittens, tobacco pouches, soap, sweets, pastries, cakes, writing paper, envelopes, pencils, dried fruits, wine from the south, cheap cologne, you couldn't count it all. The gifts came from factories, collective farms, schools, and even kindergartens. These gifts, caringly packed in cardboard boxes and plywood crates, which also contained letters and photographs, brought boundless joy to those at the front. Unfortunately, the path of the gifts to the front went through dirty hands. Not even half the goods reached the men at the front. Mikuláš abruptly took this gift business under the party's eye, earning praise from both Regiment Commander Razumovsky and Commissar Gruzdev for his work. But, as always, Mikuláš didn't forget about himself. Each time a batch of gifts arrived at the regiment, he hastily dropped all his other work and headed for the rear. He always made sure to placate the commissary workers, headquarters personnel and representatives from the battalions, who had been arguing over every package and who had once even discussed the meaning of the concept front. One day Mikuláš returned to the political unit with 3 blankets, and he managed to talk us into taking them. The gift-sending epic continued, and Mikuláš one day neatly dragged a densely stuffed large pouch full of little things back to the political unit, laying the unjustly acquired loot under his bunk. How easy it is to deceive ourselves. I saw what was happening, but I sought not to get involved. Yet the moment arrived when I could no longer tolerate it, and I decided to consult with Stepanich about what to do. The major brushed me off like I was a fly. Then, relying on my friendship with him, I bluntly told Mikuláš everything I thought about the pouches from the rear. "Excuse me, Mikuláš," I said, "but what are you doing? You're taking mother's gifts to their sons at the front and transferring them to Ivanovo. For such behaviour you'll get no thanks from the frontline soldiers, for many of them, you know, have wives and children at home just like you do. They say, The littlest fly can bite the largest horse. Turning crimson, Gavrilov rudely responded, "And who's showing any concern for my little ones? The local authority spits on them. What's it to you? Your mother is in Moscow, warm and without any concerns." "Well, that's really gone too far. Be offended or not, that's your business, but I've now told you my position. You are not only a father, you're also a regiment party organizer. You talk with people and proclaim patriotic words. Others are watching you and following your lead. Have you noticed how the guys in the rear area of the division all smell of cologne?" "You'd better watch your tongue, Komsomol member. You're still wet behind the ears. Now take my advice. Don't try and give lessons to your elders." I said nothing and lay down with my face buried in the pillow. I was sorry for him because of his family, but everything welled up inside me. The soldiers were anxiously waiting for their gifts, letters, and even that very same cheap cologne, but they were only going to receive a gnawed fin, while the golden fish swam off into different seas. Stepanich was the complete opposite of Mikalich. One could say he was a simple creature. To gain an understanding of him was not difficult, so therefore some called him a kind-hearted simpleton, while others called him blockhead. Stepanich looked badly. He had a puffy face with heavy bags under his eyes, as if he was always suffering from some kind of hangover. He drank tea continuously, up to 10 or more cups a day. He was ponderous, as if shackled by a heavy armour suit. You couldn't budge him from his spot with a tank. He was often quiet. He had 4 locks of hair that fell down over a deeply lined brow. His eyes were concealed behind the thick lenses of his eyeglasses, their temples neatly connected by little strings. Stepanich was always afraid to lose his eyeglasses, always cautious with them, and took good care of them. It was a disaster to lose your eyeglasses at the front. They said that soldiers from burial details and medics often collected eyeglasses from the battlefield and traded them for tobacco and vodka. Stepanich liked to divide his day into 2 halves. From morning until lunch he was immersed in the newspapers, and he liked to neatly underscore interesting notes, facts and numbers. In the second half of the day he pored over one particular pillar of science under the title 6 Lenin on Propaganda and Agitation, daily reading through and summarizing portions of the text. He carried this fat book everywhere with him in a pouch, not entrusting his precious possession to anyone else. At some point I once asked him, "What's the difference between propaganda and agitation?" He bombarded me with a string of Lenin's quotes, expounding for a long time on that which could have been explained without difficulty within a minute. Plainly, he received enormous satisfaction from the very process of pronouncing words himself. He indeed received the nickname Blockhead because of the tediousness of his speeches. Stepanich loved to sing the well-known Red Cavalryman's song that went, "We're trampling the enemy under the hooves of our horses. We're meeting the enemy in the Stalinist style." While he sang, he would adroitly tap his foot in time to the music under his desk. Once I asked him why he loved this song so much. "Well, I was in the cavalry," Stepanich proudly answered. Stepanich joined the army in 1938 through a party directive that called 4,500 communist teachers into the army for political work. Stepanich had lost the martial qualities with which he had entered the army and somehow managed to survive the first year of the war. Thereafter, and until the end of the war, no one ever saw Stepanich with a rifle in his hands again. Such were Captain Mikalich and Major Stepanich. Daily encountering people like this in my position as Komsomol organizer, I could feel how I was becoming ever more dull and apathetic myself, and a spiritual vacuum began to grow inside me. Watching how such people schemed to construct a resort lifestyle just behind the front lines, I thought, these are precisely the same people who will survive the war. After the war, they'll leave the army and start a free life of hunting and fishing. Meeting over a bottle of vodka or a cup of tea, they'll start reminiscing with deep pathos over the battles where they fought together. And of course they'll demand respect from the frontline veterans for the services they rendered. How different was our life in the political unit from the life of those in the trenches. There, they never bothered to lift a hand to salute, and you especially didn't dare order around a soldier if you yourself had ever screwed up at some dangerous moment, or were never able to display your own personal courage and fearlessness. I was constantly drawn to return to the front lines, back to the people with whom I had started my combat journey. Yes, there it was, harder and more dangerous, but there I also felt part of a righteous, genuine life that, no matter the paradox, was more joyful than my current life. I saw much around me in the army's rear that disturbed and upset me, but I was troubled most of all by questions about myself. Perhaps something had already changed in me. Would I ever take an independent position? Yes, well, maybe when hell freezes over or a fish learns to sing. To hell with all of them. Colonel Razumovsky. Another month passed. Increasingly rarely did I visit the front, as I was weighed down by endless verbal and paper bustle, conferences, assemblies, meetings with fresh reinforcements, assignments from the commissar or the party organizer, or unexpected seminars at the division or army level. My most pleasant event during this month became my acquaintanceship with new comrades, the battalion Komsomol organizers Vania Skoropud and Boris Flegboim. I also befriended a plump, rosy-cheeked little fellow, Sergeant Vasya Ragulin. Within a half-year, he would take my place and become the Komsorg for the 673rd Rifle Regiment. One day Gruzdev called, "This evening report to the regiment, Commander." "Certainly," I responded. At the appointed time, I was standing in front of Maxim Petrovich Razumovsky. The colonel invited me to sit down and said, "It's been a month now that you've been serving as Komsorg of the regiment. You know the situation at the front. You've spent some time in many of the battalions and batteries, and you've become acquainted with the rear. I would like to hear your opinion of the units which you have visited." "My impression is a good one," I answered. "Have you noticed any defects?" "Yes, I noticed a few. I'm listening to you." "First of all, about the reinforcements. With each new batch, their quality worsens. About half of the most recent arrivals are new conscripts. They're poorly trained, badly dressed and poorly shod, and they're hungry when they arrive. While we're staying on the defence, it would be desirable to hold them a little longer in the training battalion. Political workers and regiment command rarely appear at the front, not to mention commissary staff. The work of the mail service is poorly organised, but these aren't the main things. Go on. Firstly, we haven't received the promised submachine guns. Even the regiment's submachine gun company still carries carbines. Secondly, there is insufficient care for the soldiers in the front lines. The soldiers in the trenches are poorly uniformed, and they're freezing. Their coats are worn out and often torn. Many of the coats have flaps that have been scorched by campfires. Their footgear is full of holes, and their foot wrappings are half rotten. The American low boots have been arriving in 1s and 2s. There are also defects in nutrition. Hot meals still arrive irregularly, and it would be nice to bring up hot tea in addition. It would be desirable to organize steam baths for groups of soldiers, who could be taken out of the front line at least twice a week. What can I say? I agree with you, and I'm glad that a combat officer became the regiment's Komsorg. We must both ponder all of this and take the appropriate measures. Now, let's have a chat about your work. You know about our glittering victory at Stalingrad, and that an enemy army of 300,000 has been crushed there. We must let both our soldiers and the Germans know about this victory, since much is being hidden from the German soldiers. Now, your trump card is Stalingrad. Explain to the Red Army soldiers that even here, fighting at Rzhev, we have done our own bit and sacrificed much for the sake of this victory at Stalingrad. This will raise the warriors' spirits and their faith in the success of our efforts. Lieutenant, I'm an old officer, and I'm sure, as you can see, that soon we'll take Rzhev as well. Comrade Colonel, I asked, please give me a few more minutes of your time. Young soldiers and officers want to know more about their regiment commander. If you please, tell me about yourself. I understand you. I'll try, said the colonel. During World War I graduated from the Alexander Military School as an ensign. At the end of the war, I was a lieutenant and the acting commander of a battalion. After the October Revolution, I switched my support to the Bolsheviks. I fought in the Russian Civil War. After my wounding and convalescence in a hospital, I was sent to Turkestan, where I fought for 3 years against the Basmachi, the Soviet label given to those who participated in a general uprising against Soviet-Russian rule in Central Asia. Later, I served in the north, and I took part in the campaign against Finland. In 1941, I defended Moscow. I served in Rokossovsky's 16th Army, which I now consider a great honour. I was severely wounded. After my spell in the hospital, I was sent to the 220th Rifle Division. For my service in the fighting in front of Moscow, I received the Order of the Red Banner. That, in short, is everything. I don't know if you find what I've said satisfactory. Fully satisfactory, Comrade Colonel. Thank you very much. With that, we parted ways. Back in the political unit, Mikhalich, having heard my story of my meeting with Razumovsky, added to the regiment commander's biography. After the Civil War, Razumovsky, as a former officer in the Tsarist Russian army, had been reduced in rank and sent to fight the Basmachi rebels as a test of his loyalty to the Bolsheviks. In 1938, he was repressed, targeted by Stalin's purge of the military. After 2 years in prison, he was released and sent to serve in the north. The conversation inspired me. This military officer most likely was not just a man of words, and his orders were based on his enormous personal experience in command and in war. I involuntarily compared the regiment commander to his commissar, Gruzdev. Once a modest village teacher, Gruzdev had entered a new role and had changed so quickly. Party work didn't interest him, and he seemed to care less about what the officers thought of him, much less the soldiers. He knew he was the highest political authority in the regiment and believed he was the conscience of the regiment. It was useless to try to convince him of something, and I would never think to speak with him openly as I did with Razumovsky. At the end of February, an event occurred that agitated not only the regiment but the entire division as well. Colonel Razumovsky received an urgent order to capture a German officer within a week at any cost. Precise information was wanted on the enemy on the opposite bank, his combat capabilities and immediate plans. Regiment reconnaissance scouts left our lines each night for this purpose, but no matter how hard they tried, they failed to reach the German trenches. The same thing was happening in other regiments of the division. The division commander, General Poplavsky, believed that something lay behind the Germans' tight security. Apparently, the enemy was doing everything possible to keep his pending retreat concealed, so as to break contact with the Soviets completely and dig in successfully in new positions. The division commander had the idea to broaden the net to capture a German officer by including officers in all the regiments, in order to attract more volunteers for this hunt. He himself went around all the regiments to meet with volunteers and to select the hunters. A team of volunteer scouts was organized in each regiment. In our regiment, 8 officers were selected by Colonel Razumovsky and Commissar Gruzdev and presented to the division commander. I was included in this magnificent 8, most likely because of my position as the regiment's Komsorg. The general didn't waste time on any fiery speeches, but simply laid out a concrete proposal to us. "Boys," he said, "I need a tongue. Help me out. We must haul in a German officer. Whoever accomplishes this will be written up for a decoration. Moreover, if you want a woman, you'll get one. If you want leave to see your mother, we'll give it to you. You'll get all the vodka you want. All our hopes are on you. A tongue is needed without fail, and urgently so. Pick yourself some volunteers and get going. The regiment headquarters and political unit will help you. Any questions?" There were no questions. We already knew the practice. If you managed to capture a tongue, an honour awaited you, as a rule, medals. If you returned without a prisoner but with some useful documents, you'd get nothing. Who at 20 years of age doesn't dream of carrying out some important mission for his homeland? To become famous? Looking at the orders decorating the service jacket of a general, even we dreamed of glory. In those days, orders and medals were very highly valued. People made much of you if you had them. After the war, we proudly wore our combat decorations on our military field blouses or our civilian jackets without any prompting. Thanks to them, we enjoyed well-known benefits, which had been created back in the pre-war period. For example, we received small sums of money for tobacco. had the right for free round-trip travel once a year to any point in the country by railway or water transportation, received subsidised housing in apartments, and so forth. For us frontline soldiers, all of this was important. Then suddenly, after the war, the government, supposedly at our request, deprived us of all those benefits. We knew the country was in difficult circumstances, and we had to accelerate the rebuilding of cities, factories, hospitals, schools, and libraries. All had been demolished, torched, and befouled, and the government's means were not large. But here 2 moral factors arose. In the first place, we honoured veterans never asked anyone about anything. If the government had come to us honestly, if its leadership had said, "We owe you frontline soldiers a lot," at that time they still didn't call us veterans. "But excuse us, we don't have the means to repay you, therefore support the government and voluntarily refuse all your benefits for some time," I'm sure everyone would have agreed. But to treat us the way the government did was dishonourable. Secondly, there must be honest mutual relations on the basis of law between a government and its citizens. What a simple truth. In the post-war years, we still didn't understand these fine points, but we sensed them. During the war, we were called to perform a great deed in the name of the motherland, of Stalin. We stepped forward in response, not sparing our lives. We stepped forward for the sake of saving the fatherland. In the name of the fatherland, we were awarded decorations, some posthumously, others still living. But once the war came to an end, we became superfluous to our fatherland. That is why, as a mark of protest, each year on May 9th for Victory Day, I put on only one soldier's medal that is precious to me, for courage, which I earned at Rzhev. One other point, which was unexpected and psychologically difficult for many of the frontline soldiers. Returning from war, we expected to see a renewed society, more free and democratic. We were the victors. That which awaited us in the cities, and especially in the villages, plunged many of us into shock. Then 30 years passed, and now people were shouting at us frontline soldiers, "Lord, when finally will you die?" I never confused a crowd with the people as a whole, but I strove not to use the benefits due to me. We hunger for the hunt. The general's address suited all of us to a T. The officers joked, "An order is a fine thing, but a good-looking woman is no worse." But think how much better, both a medal and a woman. I watched General Poplavsky and listened to him, and he impressed me all the more as a person. Not only his calm, friendly manner of speaking, but also his general appearance. He was solidly built, with a prominent nose adorning an open face, and he had arms and hands like those of a blacksmith. His words sounded sincere, and each of us understood the significance of what he was saying for the future successful operations of the division, and even of the army. It is impossible not to mention one other circumstance. We were not professional reconnaissance scouts, therefore the general's request generated a special excitement in our hearts. We were young, strong, and at that time in life when it seemed we could bear the weight of the world on our shoulders. Finally, we all had frontline experience, which meant we would not disgrace ourselves. No one doubted this. To a man, we wanted to test our strength against the adversary, to outduel him. Did any one of us understand the danger of this duel? Did anyone think about death? Both yes and no. Everyone knew that the Germans were not a laughing matter, and in the present situation, joking about them was simply impermissible. Actually, in recent weeks, the adversary had locked and sealed his front against us. It was impossible even to approach it. Not even the regimental and divisional scouts had been able to deal with this cordon, but there was a strong incentive, and we believed we could do it. I immediately suggested an idea to Poplavsky. Under the guise of being fugitives, we, together with a few hand-picked men, would steal up to their front lines with knives, pistols, and grenades, and once there we'd see how things would turn out. He rejected my plan. The hunt, as the operation was called, started that very night. I selected a group of 5 young volunteer soldiers and managed to stoke each with my confidence and desire for success. I also told them about the division commander's promises. The men in turn revealed their innermost desire. To spend even a short time back home is always the constant dream of the soldier. This dream, indeed became my main trump card in recruiting volunteers. For a half-day we discussed, consulted, and searched for the best plan. Everyone understood that the slightest mistake would mean a bullet in the forehead. That night we stealthily made our way to the opposite bank. But once there, we could find no way to reach the enemy's lines undetected. The Germans were constantly sending up illumination flares, sometimes suspended from parachutes. These would hang in the air and linger for a long time, but in the short intervals between launches, when the darkness would briefly conceal us, we managed to creep forward only a few meters. Then a new flare would light up no man's land, and we would freeze in place, blending with the snow in our white camouflage smocks, and we waited and waited. Hours passed. Our sortie dragged on and continued for an impermissibly long time. At such a pace, we would never reach the German lines before dawn, so I gave the signal to withdraw. I understood that this was useless, and we had to think up something different. The next day, just as we gathered to consult with the scouts and headquarters staff, the operation was cancelled. It turned out that the night before, when our venture met with failure, some regimental scouts had nabbed a tongue, an Oberfeldwebel, a German rank equivalent to sergeant major, named Willy Brandt from Cologne. Success. Word of this exploit instantly flew around the entire regiment. The scouts provided details of the prisoner snatch, which actually proved to be only a partial success. They hadn't been able to return with the prisoner himself. The German, a strong and stout man, put up a desperate struggle, and they had to finish him off. But the scout platoon leader, Lieutenant Shevchenko, together with 2 sergeants, brought in the man's identification tag, pistol, and soldier's book, Soldbuch, the identity document booklet carried by all active-duty German soldiers. From these, we managed to identify the German unit in front of us. Of course, this wasn't everything that the general was expecting, but nonetheless it was the first successful step. Good fellows. Both the sergeants in the successful mission were Komsomol members. I decided to meet with them, for I wanted to know in more detail how everything happened. For several days, the triumphant scouts walked around as heroes. Even though the scouts had not returned with a living prisoner, General Poplavsky decided to reward them. Lieutenant Shevchenko left for his wife and children somewhere in Ryazan Oblast. Your thoughts rush by at a gallop. Kalikov had once said, "A banal situation for the Komsorg." Now it applied to me. There was something absurd about what I now had to do. While I was making my way to the pinned-down company, the Fritzes could pick me off 1,000 times over. I would be the only upright, moving target, and the point of what I was trying to do would be obvious to the enemy. Put a cork in it. You don't discuss an order, you carry out an order. But my heart wanted to believe in something, that my assignment was a good one, that I might save people. But it was also a bad order. I would hardly be able to reach the company. But I had to act. I rushed along. The place where I could slip and slide down onto the river ice was just ahead. What's this? An unexpected obstacle. 2 soldiers' greatcoats loom in front of me, blocking my way. The pair is afraid to cross a little piece of ground, exposed to the fire of a sniper in a factory smokestack across the river. What should I do? Well, here's to it. Grabbing hold of a solid lump of ice, I hurl myself forward into the lower back of the fighter in front of me. He leaps up, as if stung by a spur, and rushes forward, forcing the comrade in front of him to do the same. They safely gallop across the dangerous interval. I fling myself after them, and at that instant the sniper manages to hit me in the left arm with an explosive bullet. Part of the sleeve of my leather jacket flies away like a bit of fluff. I am wearing a quilted jacket beneath my leather jacket. Bullet fragments become stuck in the wadding and set it on fire, while other fragments bury into my arm. Blood is pouring from the wound. I run into the nearest dugout and bandage the wound. It turns out that I have darted into the bunker of a company commander. I call the command post and report on my injury. If the regiment commander believes it essential, I will try to reach the opposite shore. Razumovsky slightly hesitates with his answer and obviously decides to send a different officer. I can plainly overhear him tell Gruzdev, "One dead Komsorg from our reconnaissance through combat is enough." The thought flashes through my mind. There's the honest explanation for Tolia's death. They sent a member of the headquarters staff in my place. The German sniper dropped him dead into the snow. Somehow the company commander himself managed to rally his men, and they burst into the adversary's trenches. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted there, which is always a cruel fight to the finish. Captured prisoners confirmed that their units would soon be retreating to new positions. The reconnaissance was successful, but there was fallout from the action. As often happens in war, there is some sort of annoying lack of coordination, an unexpected additional expense, and the losses turned out to be disproportionate to the achievement. Yes, the artillerymen piled up many Germans, but our own soldiers as well. Several shells had fallen on our own men. The question raises itself. What were the artillery spotters in the observation post looking at? The next morning I went to the Medicine-Bat. They repaired my damaged arm. Now my arm was in a sling, they said, for 2 weeks. I decided to return to my regiment. The regiment persistently prepared for a final attack on Ruzhev. Artillerymen took care of the factory smokestack on the hostile bank, so we were finally freed from the German sniper who had caused us so much trouble. A scandal erupted the day after Shevchenko's return from the leave that had been awarded to him after his partially successful prisoner snatch. The enraged division commander Poplavsky drove up to the regiment command post with some officers from the special department. Nobody understood what had happened. The regiment commander summoned his staff and political unit to his command dugout. Once inside, General Poplavsky ordered that the regiment's chief scout be brought before him immediately. Shevchenko was quickly brought in without any explanation. He, sensing a roasting, nevertheless maintained his composure, until he ran into the general's infuriated gaze. A wild scene then ensued. Poplavsky asked the scout platoon commander just one question. "What are you, a Soviet officer or a piece of shit?" Shevchenko went deathly pale and quailed in his place. He wanted to say something, apparently, in his own defence, but the division commander had already advanced upon him. The heavy hand of the general tore the straps off Shevchenko's shoulders with a jerk, then came smashing down on the upper jaw of the now former officer. Spitting out some teeth with blood, Shevchenko flew to the floor and howled like a badly wounded beast. But this wasn't a howl of pain or a cry of protest. It was more like a cry for mercy. "Get up, swine!" the general commanded. Shevchenko staggered to his feet and immediately received a blow to his lower jaw. Dumbfounded, we stood along the wall of the dugout, not understanding what had happened or what the scout was accused of doing. He was now crawling along the floor of the dugout around the general, mechanically repeating one thing: "Forgive me, forgive me." From despair, pain, and terror, Shevchenko decided not to rise to his feet again, fearing another blow from the general. Like a worm, he squirmed up to the general's boots and tried to embrace them. Poplavsky twisted his face in disgust. A new blow followed, then a boot to the face. Shevchenko flew into a corner of the dugout and huddled into a ball. Dazed, confused, he now understood little of what was going on. His whole body was trembling, and he could only whimper. Oh God, how much longer would this bloody reprisal continue? For whose benefit has this demonstration been intended? I'm not a quaking maiden. I don't need any sedatives, but I was totally appalled. At this moment, the general's voice loudly, like a judge handing down a sentence, broke the deathly silence. "A man without character is not a man, but a nobody. This scoundrel has committed a crime. He will stand trial. He has soiled the officer's honour. Excuse me, but I am in a hurry. The regiment commander will accompany me to my car. The commander of divisional reconnaissance will make an announcement to all of you." The officers from the special department lifted Shevchenko by his arms, dragged him bloodied and barely alive out of the dugout, and led him away. Captain Mishchenko was brief in his statement to us. "The general, for some reason, checked up on your scouts. He turned in their report to the army, and the report passed up to the front command. There they are always checking and rechecking the intelligence. The front has agents behind enemy lines. As a result, it was discovered that this German unit, which Shevchenko's intelligence indicated we were facing, is currently located in France. Your Shevchenko never even laid eyes upon any Oberfeldwebel. All these supposedly captured items had been pulled out of the regimental supply train by his scouts, where they had been secretly keeping them since the summer offensive. By order of the division commander, your regimental scout platoon now has a new commander. Are there any questions? Everyone was silent. 2 days later, the regiment's officers were summoned to the regiment command post. They drew us up in a line facing the execution spot. Osobisti brought in Shevchenko and placed him 20 paces in front of our line. A representative from the division's military tribunal, a lieutenant colonel, read out the sentence. The regiment commander called an officer from out of our line, a major from the headquarters staff, and, having handed him a submachine gun, ordered, "Carry out the sentence." The condemned man collapsed onto his knees in the snow, swollen all over, almost toothless, mumbling something. Then, with tears in his eyes, he cried out some disconnected words, hoping for mercy to the very end. "Don't kill me! I'll atone with my own blood, for the sake of my children. Don't kill me!" I suddenly recalled that Shevchenko had been wearing a wedding ring. I remembered it precisely. I saw it on him that evening when the general was severely dealing with the rogue. It was not on his finger now. We heard a burst of submachine gun fire. Had the hands of the staff member been shaking, or did he do it intentionally? The condemned man was still alive. He no longer could see anything and didn't understand what was happening with him. He couldn't rise, but he crawled, mumbling something with his toothless mouth, covered with blood, trying to reach the standing line of officers. If they spared him, he would lick all their boots, but they never spared anyone like him. With a few quick steps, the regiment commander approached and fired several rounds from his pistol into him. The twisted, lifeless body lay frozen on the bloody snow. It was the first time I had witnessed a public execution. Moreover, a man from my regiment and a comrade combat officer. But I felt no pity for Shevchenko, nor probably did anyone else. One question occupied us all. Why had the platoon leader done this? Why had he committed this betrayal? What drove him to falsify intelligence reports to such an extent? None of us received an answer in general, it seems to me, in each case. It depended on the respective intelligence of the commander and the deputy political commander, on their tact and ability to handle themselves in any situation. Many former commissars were sent for retraining, so that they could become commanders, if only in the infantry. Why did soldiers call the political workers in the regiment commissars after the introduction of unity of command in the army? Probably because the basic aim of their activity at the front didn't change much. The political worker, just as was true for the commissar before, was the political supervisor over the adherence to party demands within the unit. In a way, he was a sort of unique personal blocking detachment to prevent a retreat from party dictates. I am the 3rd Komsomol organizer for the 673rd Rifle Regiment in the past 2 years. The first was killed back in 1941 around Vitebsk. The second was severely wounded. What will be my fate? I don't know. At first, I didn't think I had enough frontline experience. Then I mastered my position and understood that my primary task, like that of all political workers, boils down to forcing the soldier to fight at any cost. Few can be persuaded. That's what they taught us at the Military Political Specialist School, so that's how I behave. My heart is heavy whenever my eyes meet the gaze of a soldier. I have begun to notice that I have become like all the other political workers. As soon as I try to waver from banal speeches and empty gestures, they immediately try to bring me back into the common herd. Well, it is far too much. You can't overcome the Germans with a simple hurrah. They know how to fight stubbornly and have better weapons than we do. They have a strong army. Many commanders ignore these obvious facts. We stay silent. For praising the Germans, one can wind up in front of a tribunal. With contempt, I found out that some soldiers, among them a Komsomol member, were raising a hand above the parapet of the trench in the hope that a stray bullet would strike it. From military prisoners, it became known that the Germans at first laughed at these Ivans, but then began to help them. The number of self-inflicted wounds is growing. The command is furious. But the matter extends beyond the self-inflicted wounds. Such cases have a serious influence on morale and inspire the German soldier. There is no avoiding this fact. Somewhere I once read the following saying, "No one can become someone or achieve anything, not having first learned to be oneself." Am I often being myself? Moreover, what does to be yourself mean? I ought to think seriously about this. They say that human feelings disappear in war. Animal instincts replace them. That is true. But I have noticed that in suitable conditions, human feelings are resurrected. Apparently, this is how we differ from animals. I have participated in several battles with the Germans. I have seen how comrades die and enemies perish. At first, I found it totally gut-wrenching when I saw a bloodied body. But now I am used to it. I am now accustomed to all the horrors of war. Why do soldiers often distrust us officers? Their distrust is painful. They don't like us very much, but they submit to our directions. Unfortunately, this situation suits many political workers. What I've written above should be pondered. We are Stalin's generation. This says everything about us. Am I proud of this? Why do they respect a man at the front, be he a soldier or a general? For his honesty and steadfastness. Among us officers, both these qualities are often lacking. Why is this so? We all grew up in the Soviet era. Thinking about the acts of the army's bureaucracy, I see nothing new in them. In my school years, I loved to read books about wars. Many authors did not speak kindly about those in the rear. Even Suvorov took personal aim at them. Often, they do not even do what they are supposed to do. Oh, if only a writer like Anton Pavlovich Chekhov would let loose on this fraternity. But where could such a writer be found today, and who would permit him to touch upon such a topic? I heard a story. In the difficult year of 1941, they reported to Stalin that approximately 2 million military servicemen were lounging around in the rear areas of the Red Army. The Supreme Commander immediately ordered the rear area to be swept and all the personnel sent to the front. It never happened. Probably even Stalin had forgotten something. Who then was the main provider of supplies and ammunition in the Red Army? Military horse-drawn carts. There were not enough vehicles in the army. Apparently the Supreme Commander had forgotten as well about the Russian roads. Finally, who, where, when has anyone in history been able to handle the bureaucracy? No one. We've been lucky with Commissar Borisov. You rarely find such a man in an army environment. Several times, when the situation permitted it, he gathered us together and told us certain details from the division's history. It was especially interesting to listen to him when he explained why the Germans campaigned against and executed commissars, communists, and Soviet intellectuals. The Germans saw in these people the main ideological support for the Soviet regime, the Ruzhev meat grinder. After reading through Tolia's notebooks, I set them aside and discovered a thin green envelope lying on the bottom of the suitcase. Inside the envelope were 7 sheets of paper containing tiny, neat handwriting. It was clearly a story that Tolia Razumov had written. I thought that at some time I might try to publish the story in honor of the fallen Komsorg Tolia Razumov. I am doing this now. 7,000 Steps to Immortality. This story occurred around New Year's Day 1942 in besieged Leningrad. Few know about it. Nevertheless, through separate kernels of the story, which later became known, I will try to reconstruct it without losing touch with the truth of the time. It was a frigid day. The gloomy sky of early morning promised nothing good. A group of 5 men, far from young, dressed in whatever they could find that might help keep them warm, gathered on Senaya Square. The majority of them lived nearby. The trolley had long ago stopped running. One of the men, a little younger and a little stronger than the others, had dragged along a string of sledges behind him. He had carefully lain little canvas bags on them, each one containing only the daily ration of bread, 125 grams, a little more than 4 ounces, cottonseed flat cakes, and a few short, narrow strips of leather cut from a belt strap, Leningraders had long before started holding up their trousers with string or cord. If you sucked a bit on the leather, your acute sense of hunger would deaden for a short while. The oldest fellow gave a sign. Then they headed on their way. Where were they going? Why? Nobody asked, and they didn't say a word. They moved slowly, carefully supporting each other. The eldest walked in front, leaning on a cane, the only one for all five. A woolen stocking covered his face, like all the others. Now here's the Senia market. Not so long ago, human voices and the cooing of pigeons sounded all around, streetcars clattered, and the air was intoxicating with the scents of flowers, honey, warm bread, and pickled cucumbers. All had vanished. The human voices and bird calls had fallen silent. The market stalls had become buried under dirty piles of snow, and the doors to the pavilions yawned wide open. The buildings, emptied, covered by ash, greeted them with semi-darkened windows, behind which had disappeared even the shadow of human life. The Liberation of Rojhev, 2. The 3rd of March, 1943. For almost 15 months, the 30th Army, under the command of General Lelyushenko, had been conducting cruel, bloody battles in the Rojhev bridgehead, trying to take the city. The month of February 1943 became decisive in the struggle for the city. All through the second half of February, the Army Command had been receiving intelligence that the adversary was preparing to abandon Rojhev. The commander of the 215th Rifle Division, General Kuprianov, he became division commander at the beginning of February 1943, had the same evidence. The situation became highly charged. By that time I was serving in the 31st Army's 220th Rifle Division, so I will cite the recollections of a veteran of the 215th Rifle Division, radio-telephone operator Kechi Iakin. The wounded general was transported to the Medsanbat, but he died en route. By the instruction of the army commander, the body of General Kuprianov was taken back to Rojhev and buried there, in the city that he had helped to liberate. On the 22nd of March, in a letter to Kuprianov's wife and children, the army commander Kolpachi wrote, "Today we will be escorting our combat friend to his final rest. The ancient Russian city Rojhev, which units of Comrade Kuprianov's division were the first to cleanse from the fascist scum, has become the final landmark in his life. The city will eternally honor the memory of the Bolshevik general Andrei Filimonovich Kuprianov. The entire combat collective of the army expresses to you our deepest condolences." An obelisk now stands on a high hill in the center of Rojhev, a monument to the fallen general, Andrei Filimonovich Kuprianov. I can still remember how quickly the news of his death reached us. If you will, the 30th Army never knew another division commander like him, highly professional, wise, strong-willed, and thrifty, with respect to each soldier's life. How happy Andrei Filimonovich would have been had he survived to the end of the war and known that his 215th Rifle Division had become the 215th Red Banner Smolensk Rifle Division, awarded the orders of Suvorov and Kutuzov. How delighted the general would have been, knowing that this combat honorific for the 215th Rifle Division had been bestowed upon it for its role in liberating his native Smolensk. After the liberation of Rojhev, our forces kept moving forward, pursuing the Germans as they withdrew from the Rojhev salient. We didn't have time to stop and rest, for it was important not to let the enemy withdraw without hindrance and consolidate in new positions. With constant skirmishing against enemy rear-guard units, we advanced, winning back a mutilated and emptied native land. But we also confronted another familiar antagonist. The first warm breath of spring had melted almost all the snow, turning it into slush, and soon the roads turned into a swampy sludge. We marched, barely able to move our feet. Overcoming with unbelievable labours the onset of the spring Rasputitsa, literally the dissolution of roads, when the spring thaw turned Russian dirt roads into morasses. The division moved westward, approaching Smolensk. The land around had been disfigured by the blasts of bombs and shells and was filled with mines. There was a lot of trouble with the mines, which also slowed our movement. At the same time, we had to lug everything for ourselves: our rifle, cartridges, kit bag, gas mask, sapper's shovel, canteen, and grenades.